Thank you, everyone. As Mary Catherine just shared, I'm from New York State, upstate, but I don't want you all to judge me for that because I actually spent more than half of my life in the South. I'm from Texas originally, and I lived in North Carolina also. So more than half my life I've been in the South, so don't hold me accountable to the New York label, please. So also like Mary Catherine, I don't come to this with my own personal story in terms of the death penalty's impact on me directly. I'm not a murder victim family. I'm not a death row family. I haven't served time in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Those aren't the labels that are applied to me, which are applied to most of the people on the journey of hope that's taking place. So I'm a little bit of an outlier. Mary Catherine's a little bit of an outlier in terms of that we're bringing the perspective of those who are standing in solidarity and trying to amplify the voices of those who have been impacted by the death penalty in various ways. With that said, I wanted to share a little bit about my story of how I got involved in this, and specifically to the topic of this evening around hospitality for the death row families. As I said, I grew up in Texas. I went to college in Texas, and while I was there, I attended 2 execution vigils, both as a very young person, once as a senior in college, and then once when I was just a few months out of college. And the first time I went to an execution vigil, that's what birthed the photography project that you see out in the foyer today. It was actually a product of a college art assignment that I've decided to continue with 25 years later because I'm that kind of student. And so the photography out there is kind of birthed from my introduction into the death penalty by attending a vigil outside of the prison. The thing that really galvanized me in this work to want to stand up and to vocalize my opposition to the death penalty and to try and do more as an advocate is that on the second execution, that vigil that I went to in Texas, I had an extraordinarily transformative experience. And this is going to echo some of the things that Mary Catherine shared with you, because that experience that I had was being in the presence of a family member at the moment of a loved one's execution. And I didn't know I was going to be in that situation. I was young, I was naive, I didn't know how the process worked. It never crossed my mind that perhaps a family member of a death row prisoner would not want to be inside the prison watching the state murder their child, their father, their mother, whoever it was. And so I found myself at that vigil standing outside just 10 feet away from the mother and stepfather of the man who was being executed that night, Larry Robeson. And as I stood there and witnessed what a mother feels and how she responds in that moment is a memory that is forever seared into my brain. The image of a mother, she was holding a photo of her son and she was crying. The tears were streaming down her face and she was wailing. And to witness that is an extraordinary moment that really called me to want to do more, because I knew what the person being executed had done. I knew about his crime, and it was a horrible crime. I'm not excusing it, but to see how a family was impacted, there was no excuse for that. This mother had done nothing wrong. She actually tried to help her son. She wrote a letter to the state of Texas when she realized her son had severe intellectual disabilities and asked for help from the state. Their response was, "Sorry, ma'am, we cannot help you because your son has no history of violence." And his first act of violence was to murder 5 people. So this mother tried so hard to help her son, and this is what the state gave her, was that moment of having her son strapped to a gurney and executed. And for me to stand there and witness that, as I said, transformed me, and it made me want to do more. Shortly after that, I moved out of Texas. That's when I became a northerner for a while. And I went to Massachusetts. And lo and behold, Massachusetts does not have the death penalty, unlike Texas, but there was still a lot to do. The state was trying to reinstate the death penalty. There was a federal trial. happening, I got involved in an Amnesty International chapter that was actively working on a Texas death penalty case. So I became drawn to that because I just left Texas. And so I began working with Amnesty International on a particular case. And they empowered me through some funding and support to go to Texas to visit this man on death row. And so I did that. After getting involved in this amnesty group, I went to Texas to visit this man on death row. I was still a young, poor, just out of college student, and so I was trying to figure out where to stay. And I found this place called a Texas hospitality house, and it was near the prison where death row was. And I found out that I could stay there for free as I was there to visit this man on death row. And that concept really blew my mind. And I started asking questions and looking more into it. And I was really inspired by this idea of providing hospitality for those in need directly related to the death penalty. Because I was thinking of that woman during the execution and wondering what kind of support she had and what kind of support she needed. And then I found this hospitality house, and it was supporting me. And I could see it supporting the other people around me. Shortly after those experiences of visiting someone on death row myself, I became aware of the Catholic Worker, which Mary Catherine also referenced. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Catholic Worker or Dorothy Day. All right, there's a good amount here. For those of you who haven't, just really basically, Dorothy Day started a hospitality house in New York City in the 1930s. She was Catholic, she was a lay woman, and she believed in personal responsibility, that it was up to us as individuals to take responsibility for the suffering around us. And so she opened up her own personal home to those who had needs for housing, for food, and for shelter, for comfort. And she inspired a movement where now there's over 100 houses of hospitality around the country and around the world, and many more who are inspired by the Catholic Worker, who have opened their doors, people taking personal responsibility to look out for those who are disadvantaged and in need. And I was inspired by that, and I ended up moving into a Catholic Worker house in Boston when I was living in Massachusetts. And I had these more transformational moments of the power of hospitality, of out of our own home, having people come to us and offering the assistance that they needed. And in Boston, we worked with the homeless, and so providing food and shelter and clothing, those kinds of things. So fast forward a little bit in my story, there's a lot I could say. I wear a lot of different hats. I do a lot of different things. It's the photojournalism, still work with Amnesty International and a number of things. So there's a lot of stories to share around this. But the thing that's most pertinent tonight is that in my discovery of the Catholic Worker House in Boston and remembering my time visiting the prisoner in Texas, I began doing some research and realizing that there were more houses of hospitality that were working specifically with death row and with prisons. I learned about New Hope House here in Georgia. I learned about the Alderson, West Virginia house that works with the women's federal prison there and other houses around the country. And I was really inspired by that. And at that time, I was engaged to a woman, and we were getting married, and we were trying to think, how do we want to start our new life as a couple? And we were both inspired by the Catholic Worker, inspired by these houses of hospitality. So what we did was, when we got married, we said, no gifts, we just want your money. And we're gonna take your money, and we're gonna go start a hospitality house. And we randomly chose North Carolina. I say random, I was feeling called to the Catholic Worker and called to working against the death penalty, but I wasn't waiting for God's call to tell me where to go. I just looked at basic statistics. And at that time, North Carolina was the number 2 executing state in the country, behind Texas. I knew Texas has a hospitality house, so I just went next on the list. North Carolina. Never been there in my life, but we just packed up our stuff and drove there, rented the closest house we could near the prison, and just said, this is a hospitality house, because that's what Dorothy Day did. She just opened up her apartment in the Lower East Side and said, this is a hospitality house. And so that's what we did. And we immediately connected with the legal capital defense program that was in North Carolina that was working closely with the death row prisoners and said, hey, we're here, we don't know anyone, we just showed up out of the blue, we have this vision, how can we implement it? And they said, we know the right person for you. We know this woman named Peggy, and Peggy has a son on death row, and she could use your help. And so they put us in touch with Peggy. And Peggy was our first visitor. And it took a while before we could welcome her. We were sleeping on the floor. We had no furniture, real basics kind of there. But once we got to bed, we invited Peggy. And Peggy, we learned, was driving 4 hours, because she lived in South Carolina. She was driving 4 hours to North Carolina to visit her son on death row. And she got a 90-minute visit. So that's 8 hours in the car for a 90-minute visit. And the emotional exhaustion that she told us she felt from driving all that way to see her son through the plexiglass, not being able to touch her son, knowing the state is trying to kill her son, was just too much, that she would never drive home afterwards. She would drive to the Walmart parking lot and sleep in her car. That is what she did, because she had no money and no support to get a hotel or to have anyone travel with her to help with the driving. And so she was our first guest. And this woman was a cheerleader for us. She really appreciated having that bed, the warm meal, someone to talk to after a visit. And so she began in the visiting room of death row. She was our evangelist. She was telling everyone, you got to go to Scott's house. You got to go to Scott's house. They got great food, and they got beds, and they'll pick you up at the Greyhound station, whatever. And so she began promoting it. And so we began getting more and more people coming to the house. But we wanted to have a bigger impact than that. And so we wrote letters to all the men and women on death row in North Carolina. And there were, I think, 160, 170 at that time. It was one of the largest death rows, which is also why I chose to go there. And we wrote all these letters. We moved into the house in October. We got settled. In November, we sent all these letters to every prisoner on death row saying, hey, this is here for your families, for your loved ones, for your friends. We want to help. And the thing that happened in response to that was not at all what we expected. We got so many letters back from prisoners saying, we really appreciate you, but I don't get visitors. And as I thought more about that, I realized there was so many reasons why people don't have visitors on death row. Because as Kathy shared in the opening, like, people who are on death row are coming from communities that are riddled with violence and with poverty and with so much that for people to get a visit from family actually in North Carolina was rare, we found out. That people didn't even have the money to get to Raleigh, North Carolina, where the death row was. People didn't have an interest in continuing visiting with a loved one because some of these people have been on death row for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. Can you imagine trying to sustain that momentum of visitation? And also, I learned a lot of people are on death row for murdering family members. And so these families are broken, and there's lost connections and a lot of trauma and a lot of tragedy. And so when we got these letters back from the prisoners, they basically were saying, we don't have visitors, we're glad to know you exist, but I could use a pen pal. And so almost accidentally, our ministry became more of a pen pal ministry than an actual hospitality house. And just a sad commentary on really kind of the how desolate it is on death row is that I believe the prisoners are issued 4 or 5 Christmas cards every year that they're allowed to send to family or friends. Most of those letters we got back in response to our letter were on those Christmas cards. They had no one else to send those Christmas cards to other than these complete strangers that had just happened to move into a house down the road from their prison. And so that was really eye-opening to kind of really realize the solitary and the loneliness of the death row in North Carolina. And so we began a pen pal program of just ourselves writing to 40 to 50 prisoners a week. This was our daily meditation. This is what we did. We would write and write and write and maintain these friendships and provide that support while still welcoming the families and friends that we were able to. And unfortunately, in North Carolina, as Mary Catherine said, she is able to visit a lot of people on death row. North Carolina has a policy, you can only visit one person on death row. And so for us at this hospitality house, it didn't feel fair to pick the one person. You know, it's like choosing your favorite child. You just don't do it. And so I wasn't actively involved with visitation on death row, but I was involved very actively with the pen pal connection and providing the hospitality to the families. So those are two elements of our ministry. The third element of our hospitality house was that we wanted to resist and to protest what was happening. Because as I said, North Carolina was the second most executing state at that time behind Texas. So while I was there for 2 years, it was only 2 years, they were executing a prisoner every 6 weeks in the state of North Carolina. And so every 6 weeks, we had families coming and staying in our house to witness all over again that horror and that trauma of watching families go through this. And meanwhile, we were trying to organize vigils at the prison, gathering people for candlelight vigils, for prayer, things like that. So that was also an element of our work, was to provide this public-facing resistance to what the state was doing. And the death row is it's not out in the middle of nowhere like in Jackson. There's like a busy thoroughfare. North Carolina State University, I don't know how big that place is, like 20,000 students. It's literally next door to the prison. So there's ample visibility. So we were organizing a lot of visibility of getting people out there to protest what was going on. And while I was there in North Carolina, there was an execution coming up in December of one year, and it was this country's 1,000th execution. And there became a little tradition in the death penalty movement of marking these milestones around executions. So the 500th execution happened in South Carolina, and people went and they blocked the driveway to the prison in North Carolina that night, or South Carolina that night, and they got arrested as an act of peaceful civil disobedience to protest that execution in South Carolina. And then fast forward a few years later, we're already at the 1,000th execution. And so people wanted to organize a protest to do a similar thing, to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience to protest that execution. And so me and my community took charge of organizing that. And a lot of people from the Journey of Hope wanted to participate. And so we were joined by murder victim family members from all over the country, death row exonerees, and even some death row families to come and to participate in this action at the prison. And what we did was there's a driveway off the main road that goes down into the parking lot, and we attempted to walk down the driveway towards the prison with the stated intention that we were there to stop the execution. We know this isn't practical, but we said, we're gonna go into the prison and we're gonna stop. We're gonna, interfere with this process. Of course, we didn't get very far. You're blocked by the line of the, riot police squad people who are preventing you from going any further. But we were arrested and charged with trespassing because we were on prison property. And that moment born a new element of our work, which was to do this at every execution. It wasn't just to mark the 1,000th execution. We kept doing it every 6 weeks, execution after execution. And we kept that going as part of our tradition and our work to resist the state and put our bodies on the line. And Dorothy Day also advocated for this. Dorothy Day herself would participate in nonviolent civil disobedience, standing in solidarity with the farm workers, working against nuclear weapons and all these things. She put her life on the line and herself on the line to protest. And so we continued that tradition there on the steps of death row in North Carolina. And I just wanted to share that we didn't take that lightly, because what that meant when you're processing down a driveway and facing the wall of police, that means you're out there in the street. You're not back at the hospitality house sitting with those families who need the support. And so we each had to make a very difficult decision on those nights. Where did we want to be? And I just want to say that's the power of community, because there were enough of us to where everyone could be everywhere. And we were able to be there to hug those mothers at those moments of their loved ones being executed. We were able to speak truth to power and be thrown to the ground and handcuffed on the prison property. We were able to hold the candle in peaceful prayer on the side of the road. We were able to do all the things. But I did want to say that comes at a cost, because for me, I was really pushing the Department of Corrections and the state more than they were comfortable. A lot of these photos that are out there, some of them, particularly the ones of the execution witness room, if you saw that one, the gurney with the warden actually wheeling the gurney. I went in as a representative of the media and took these photos that you see, some of those that you see out there. I also went in with a video camera on a media tour and filmed the warden walking through and giving a tour of the prison and explaining how he executes prisoners. And I put this video on YouTube. It has over 1 million views. The prison did not like this. They did not like the fact that I was getting arrested. They didn't like the fact that I was writing to all these people, that I was helping their families. And one day I got a letter in the mail saying that I've been permanently banned and barred from having any contact whatsoever with prisoners on death row in North Carolina. That ended all of my pen pal relationships, and it ended my ability to choose that one person if I wanted to visit. And that was a cost that we knew was possible, but I made that choice in that moment. And that was because of community, that I knew we had the other community members that were still going to be there for the families. We could expand this pen pal program to continue people were still getting letters. Even if I got banned, it didn't stop it. Like, we kept our work going. And I know Mary Catherine has access to a lot of people here in Georgia, and if you're interested in writing a letter, she's the person to help. A lot of these people, I can't speak for Georgia, but as I'm saying with North Carolina, people appreciate something because they don't necessarily have a lot. And so that's a lot of what that work was about. So that's a little bit of my hospitality story. There's always like a lot of interesting stories on the side around that. But I just wanted to end by saying that my work, even though I'm not at the hospitality house anymore, even though I'm banned from that prison, the work still continues. I still continue working with the Journey of Hope. And even though I don't have that personal story thankfully, of having lost a loved one to murder or have a loved one in prison, I can still provide some of these tangible things like driving the speakers to where they need to go, to making sure the speakers who are impacted are fed. Because at the end of the day, when someone's up here telling these horrendous stories, going from these lives of trauma and violence to a place of forgiveness and healing, that takes a lot out of people. And if I can just be a driver, or if I can help create a spreadsheet or make photocopies, whatever it is, I'm happy to do it because I want to help. And I think we're all called to help in some way. It doesn't have to be as radical as moving, halfway across the country with nothing and renting a house with not an idea of what you're doing. It doesn't have to be something like that. It can be as simple as writing a letter, attending a vigil, going to a lobby day. Any of these things are powerful and important, and they matter. And I also just wanted to end by saying that the photos that are out there, that's really kind of the bulk of how I feel like I can contribute to this work. That's kind of my unique participation in this, is to continue furthering the conversation, furthering the stories. There's photos out there of some of those family members at the moment of a loved one's execution. I didn't photograph that first one that I experienced in Texas, but I photographed many since then. And for the sake of the privacy of the people who are coming to our hospitality house, I didn't photograph them in the space of our home. That was a safe space. But the photos that are out there, people were in public spaces, and I was able to capture some of that of emotion, including one from Georgia. There's a color photo you'll see of a group of people surrounding a young woman, and that was the 1500th execution. And that happened here in Georgia. And that photo is of a young girl screaming. Mary Catherine was there, I was there. There was this woman, her dad was being executed, and she was screaming, "Daddy, Daddy," over and over. Eventually, one of her friends picked her up and carried her away from the scene because she was so hysterical. And these are the moments that are happening. They're not happening every day, but they're happening at a rate that is alarming. There was about 1 to 3 executions a month in this country. And so these stories that we tell of families coming to hospitality houses, of families witnessing executions or standing outside of prisons, that story and that narrative that you see out there in the photos of walking you almost like minute by minute on what's happening, that's happening on a regular basis in this country. Georgia hasn't had an execution in 3 or 4 years, but it could happen. And we have to be prepared on how we deal with that as a community and as a society as we work to try and, from my perspective, abolish the death penalty. But, as it was stated, by Eric, maybe we're not all on the same page wanting death penalty abolition, but I think we can all say that those mothers and those fathers and those children do not deserve what the death penalty is offering them. They do not deserve what the state is offering them in those moments. And we have to stand as a community in support of those people, and that's what we're here for.